Welcome, as I say, to this meeting of the Black Book Society, and particular welcome to our speaker, Alexander Wyndham Ashworth. No relation, he says. It's my happy task to introduce him. He's an architectural historian and designer, practicing under his own name, and he advises clients not only on their buildings, but also on their art, relevant today, and their archive collections. He's got a special interest in Gibbs and in Lutyens. He read architectural history at Oxford, and later this year he's due to go back as a doctoral student to follow one of those interests, which is researching the influence of clients on Lutyens' domestic architecture. He's also spent time at other universities in London, one of which he had the dubious honour, that's his words, not mine, of being the first student to take 2 papers in his finals in Old Icelandic. Not much competition for that distinction, I imagine. Our speaker's well qualified to speak to us this evening, not only by his expertise, but also by family. He's got strong connections with the inn. They go back, I've had to rely on him for this, they go back to Humphrey Wyndham, who was called in this inn in 1560, and then to Sir Wadham Wyndham in the 17th century, Justice of the King's Bench and one of the fire judges on view upstairs, so we'll be able to have a look at him as we go through to drinks, whose however many greats it is, grandson he is. And he's calculated by 1800 some 30 members of the Wyndham family have been called to the bar by this inn. So, as you know, the subject is picture frames, history, power, and hidden significance. Our speaker, Alexander Wyndham Ashworth.
It's a great honour and indeed a pleasure to be with you all here at Lincoln's Inn this evening in the aptly named Ashworth Centre, to which I have no connection. It's also an honour to be introduced by the distinguished historian, Nicholas Lepedevin. Thank you very much, Nick, for your kind words. Whether the expectation arising from your kind words is adequately met by what follows is something I think we'll have to leave to the members of the jury. I'd also like to thank John Brisby, KC, for kindly introducing me to Dunstan Spate, as we all know, the seemingly omniscient librarian of Lincoln's Inn, who first proposed this talk, and indeed for his staff who kindly helped with photography and other elements in its preparation. Picture frames profoundly influence our experience and appreciation of art, fulfill a complex array of practical functions and sensory purposes, and can have a hidden significance that reveals important information about the time and circumstances in which both the frame and the picture for which it was designed were made. Yet all too often, picture frames are ignored. When a photographic survey was made of the Lincoln's Inn collection in 2008, no picture frames were recorded. The inference is that frames have no historic, artistic, or documentary value. In fairness, and it may surprise you to hear this, very few of the pictures in the Lincoln's Inn collection have their original frames, or even frames contemporary with them. Such is also the case in most public art galleries. That a frame can become easily separated from its picture has made historians justifiably cautious about placing too much interpretive value in them. Gallery websites, books on fine art auction catalogues tend to illustrate paintings without frames, and this has had the effect of removing frames from our consciousness and rendering these publications useless for the study of them. Ironically, many books on picture frames show frames without paintings. But it's this awkward division between fine art and decorative art, a falling between disciplines, if you like, that has held back an investigation and study and understanding of picture frames. That we know and understand so much as we do today about picture frames is really the result of a handful of art historians working in the last decades of the 20th century, and I would mention Lynn Roberts and Jacob Simon, to whom all subsequent frame historians, myself included, owe a tremendous debt. However, my approach to picture frames is not as an art historian, but as an architectural historian and designer. That architecture has influenced picture frames is well understood, though I believe greatly underestimated. It is my contention that architecture is the origin of the picture frame, and that architects have played by far the largest role in determining the stylistic development of picture frames, as I hope to make clear. While the scholarly study of picture frames is a fairly recent development, there have always been those who have understood their importance. What do G.K. Chesterton and Frank Zappa have in common, apart from a clear aversion to the tonsorial arts? For Chesterton, art consists of limitation. The most beautiful part of every picture is the frame, and Zappa concurs, though curiously for him, the frame serves to impose an apparently necessary limitation on art. If you have tended to ignore picture frames and are beginning to feel slightly guilty, please don't. The successful picture frame is intended to be a subordinate partner in a harmonious marriage with a painting, quietly emphasizing a painting's colors, composition, and visual appeal. If your eye falls first on the picture frame, then it's either inappropriately framed or you too have become a devotee of the Chesterton Zappa cult, which I would urge you not to do. Well, let's begin by examining the history and stylistic development of picture frames. While the focus of this talk is on the Lincoln's Inn collection, as the history of picture frames begins somewhat prior to the Inn's earliest examples, which date to the 16th century, a brief outline of what came before will give you some useful context. In this slide, you see the Lawgivers fresco by G.F. Watts in the New Hall, the only picture in the inn without a picture frame. Its boundary is imposed by architecture. It's seen using architectural perspective, reintroduced to Europe by the architect Brunelleschi, to create a sense of spatial illusion. Like the Watts fresco, cave paintings, the earliest form of art, were only constrained by the available wall space. There was no architectural perspective, of course, because there was no architecture. Similarly, there were no picture frames, because no one had yet looked through a window or walked through a doorway. Now, while this might sound fanciful, there's no question that with the arrival of architecture come picture frames. Initially not in a three-dimensional protective sense, but frames as pictorial compositional devices, isolating and placing attention on the subject, helping to articulate the subject's importance, separating the subject from the room, while also linking it to its setting. In other words, already demonstrating all of the sensory purposes of all picture frames to come. At Watteau's chapel, seen here, excavated in 2018, two polychromatic relief figures use doorways to travel between this world and the next. But they're also traveling between the pictorial plane into our world, and the frames create a tantalizing illusion that we too might enter through them into the pictorial or indeed spiritual world beyond. We find frames used similarly as compositional structures in mosaics across the ancient world, including this one's in Zugma in modern Turkey, fairly recently excavated. Two-dimensional, yet with decorative patterns striving to become three-dimensional, here using running gouache and Vitruvian wave scroll in the center, both patterns, incidentally, which continue to reappear in picture frames up until the 19th century. The earliest surviving three-dimensional frames are found in Romano Egypt and date from the 1st century AD. The mortised frame and slip on the left remains in good condition, and you might be able to see the palm fiber cord in the top, which is evidence of its former wall suspension. While only a handful of these Romano-Egyptian frames survive, unpainted edges on a larger number of panels support the view that more of these frames existed in antiquity. In the slightly later portrait of rather impish-looking god Heron, we see that these early frames were protective in several ways, here serving to hold together joined sections of wood to provide a stable support for the artist, but also to preserve the picture going forward, something that it appears to have done very well. And this protective function remains an important use of frames all the way up until the 16th century, when canvas began to supersede panels as the support of choice. Leaping ahead a bit and turning now to England, we continue to find decorative frames or borders used in Anglo-Saxon manuscripts, for example. Here used similarly as compositional devices and to heighten the significance of the subject, the two on the left being portraits of Anglo-Saxon kings. The Lindisfarne carpet page on the right bearing some similarity compositionally to Roman mosaics in England, such as that at Hinton St Mary, and one wonders whether they had been seen. So at this date, there is no direct stylistic link between frames and contemporary architecture. It is the emergence of Gothic architecture in the late 12th century that directly brings about picture frames in Europe that we might recognize as equivalents of their modern counterparts. These frames use Gothic architectural forms and motifs to reinforce a consistent theological position, experience, and response. From this time onward, most of the main styles of picture frames follow architectural style all the way up until the 20th century. The originality of these frames is assured because they are engaged. That is, the flat areas for painting were carved out of a solid panel, leaving wooden walls around them. The complex architecture of the Gothic frame on this Italian altarpiece, which is in the National Gallery, provides an analogue of both the celestial church and the physical church in which such works stood. The aim was, of course, to elevate an object to sacred status in order to encourage devotion. By the 14th century, the frame parts were constructed separately, though nailed and glued to the panels, so effectively still engaged. Within only a few decades, Gothic frames such as this became deeply unfashionable, the outer contour of early Renaissance devotional works being that of the classical temple, typically a single frame around a single scene, the Sacra Conversazione, and the painting using architectural perspective. It's worth pointing out that at this time, carvers still enjoyed equal status with artists, and carvers were often architects or sculptors themselves responsible for the buildings or rooms in which these works were found. Leonardo himself gilded the frame to his Virgin of the Rocks. You will have gathered then that ecclesiastical frames predominated in the medieval period. It was the emergence of princely courts in the late Middle Ages that introduced a fashion for portraiture, which in turn gave rise to the courtly and secular picture frame. These portraits were status symbols, propaganda to express the grandeur and magnificence of princes and nobles, but the earliest frames played little part in impressing the viewers. They were primarily protective. A few were painted in bright colours and textures, Some had elaborate inscriptions running around the frieze, which perhaps we've all seen, but most were painted or stained black, sometimes having a parcel gilt moulding on the sight edge, as we see in this fine original example. Lincoln's Inn is fortunate in having some good portraits from this early period, though frustratingly, none retains its original frame. However, these later reframings of Sir Robert Clarke and Lord Brackley at least reflect the colour and proportion of Tudor frames, if not their profile and construction. These Tudor box frames provided not only protection for the edges of a panel, but rather, as we saw with the god Heron some 1400 years earlier, they helped to prevent the panel from warping or splitting. The panel fitted into rebates cut into the inner edge of the frame, and once the four sides were engaged, the corner lap joints were attached with wooden dowels, as you might be able to make out here. It's important to note the frame was attached before the artist began painting, and once assembled and decorated, it's actually very difficult to separate the two without causing damage to one or both. Tudor frames became progressively more ornate, using painted and sometimes carved decoration. Predominantly they remained black and gold. The worn and faded frame on the Inn's 20th century copy of Holbein's Thomas More has the appearance of an Italian frame of around 1600. To its left is a section of a similar frame in rather better condition, where we can see that the effect relies on the balance of gilded lines and arabesque ornament painted in the frieze. As the panel gave way to the canvas as a support from the middle of the 16th century, a new development occurred, which was the detachable frame. Made independently, the picture fitted into it from behind in a manner with which we're all terribly familiar. More convenient, perhaps, but the point was that the intimate relationship that had existed between picture and frame for at least a millennium and a half was forever lost. Archival evidence reveals that a taste for gilt frames began to emerge in England in the 1590s. However, it was the acquisition of magnificent old master collections by leading members of the courts of James I, more particularly his son Charles I, that revolutionized taste in England by the introduction of finely carved and gilded frames from the continent, notably from Italy. The fashion this created stimulated a vast demand for the production of new carved and gilded frames in England. The frame styles of the early decades of the 17th century in England fall into two main groups, the first being the Italianate frames, the best known of which is the Sansovino, of which you see an example here, named for the Venetian architect and sculptor Jacopo Sansovino, typically carved with paired volutes, scrolls, and stylized foliage, drawing upon the decorative motifs commonly found in Sansovino's carved or stucco wall panels and ceiling decorations. Simultaneously, an important design movement was taking hold in Northern Europe, which featured organic, animal, marine, and grotesque masks in swirling patterns. Called auricular, because its soft, flowing cartilaginous forms have some similarity to the human ear, the movement gained much of its impetus through the work of the Van Vianen family of silversmiths, first in Utrecht and later in London, of which we see an example here. This was made from a single sheet of silver. It is in England, however, that auricular design was first applied to picture frames in the 1630s. And the auricular frame represents the second main type in the Caroline era. It rapidly became the courtly frame of choice and remained so well into the late 17th century. The characteristic use of blonde gold on these frames picks up the pale skin tones of the contemporary school of portraiture, And the curving forms of the frame echo draperies, coiffures, and male wigs of the sitters. Auricular is widely claimed as a non-architectural movement. However, its elements have clear links to the mascarons and strange creatures that inhabit the Mannerist grottos created by the architect, artist, designer Bernardo Buontalenti, for example, in the Boboli and Pratolino gardens in Italy. Further, with their swirling C-shapes, tight spirals, bold carving, use of central masks at top and bottom, and irregular silhouettes, the Sansovino and auricular frames seem to have more in common than apart. There are examples at Knoll, for instance, which appear to be a transitional style between the two. Around the time of the Restoration, 1660, a new version of the auricular frame appeared, which became known as the Sunderland, after the second Earl of Sunderland used it as a gallery frame at Althorp. The 5 fire judge portraits in the New Hall at Lincoln's Inn, painted by John Michael Wright between 1670 and 1675, are amongst the most remarkable and important surviving examples of the Sunderland frame. Impressive in both their scale and quality of carving, they feature extraordinarily complex, highly stylized patterns, though, as you can see, less sinuous and cartilaginous than the earlier auricular frames, and lacking their marine and mascaron forms. We shall return to these frames shortly to explore their hidden significance. Auricular frames were expensive, and for those merely affluent rather than limitlessly wealthy, there was an alternative at about half the cost in the cushion frame, a ubiquitous pattern from about 1640 to 1670, interestingly without obvious continental parallels. Cushion frames were carved in slight relief with scrolled and lapping leaf patterns, usually running from a clasp leaf motif in the center out to the corners of the frame, here with stylized oak leaves and half flowers. Carving lends a pleasingly varied rhythm and motion to a basic structure. When Charles II returned to England in 1660, we all know that he brought a French influence with him, and this included the early Baroque frames that had been employed by Louis XIV at Versailles. The early Baroque frames are of diverse types, though closely related to the styles of mouldings found in the architectural interiors of the time, such as the second phase of Ham House. What they have in common is naturalistic ornament, usually setting a running or repeated pattern across the surface of the frame, resulting in a marked richness of effect, as well as a harmonious rhythm. The portrait of Sir Robert Eyre has an example of the leaf and fruit frame, typically Baroque in that each ornament supports the others, and the whole gains drama from the play of light across the rhythmic texture of the frame. In the 1670s, a running pattern carved in low relief with leaves, flowers, or scrolling foliage became fashionable. And an important variant was where the extent of carving was reduced by the introduction of plain panels, as you see here, sometimes burnished to reflect light into the picture. Known as panel or lily frames, they work well as both oval and rectangular frames, as you see here in the inn's portrait of an unknown woman and Sir John Franklin. It's a frame pattern frequently to be encountered in country house collections, probably because the style remained fashionable into the 1730s and even 1740s. At the start of the 18th century, frames with prominent carved centres and corners became fashionable and remained so into the middle of the century. These were again inspired by Louis XIV's patterns. The diagonal, horizontal, and vertical lines between the corner and centre cartouche create axes that draw the eye and attention into the head and hands of the sitter, as well as creating movement and drama in a typically Baroque manner. Now, we've seen that Baroque frames were introduced from France by Catholic-leaning Stuarts and heartily embraced by Tory England. With the death of Queen Anne, the Hanoverian accession and rise of the Whigs, there arose a desire for a new style to express what I might call Whiggish English Protestantism. The tastemaker of the moment was Richard Boyle, the third Earl of Burlington, who, with somewhat curious reasoning, determined that the Palladianism of Inigo Jones of a century before was English, and therefore a suitably native style to adopt for the new age. To bring his vision to life, Burlington turned to the architect, artist, designer William Kent, whose publications and designs helped to ensure that Palladianism swiftly became the dominant style in Britain from the 1720s until it was superseded by neoclassicism later in the century. Do note here in this design of Kent's the Vitruvian scroll or wave pattern in the frieze, which we first saw in the Zeugma mosaic 2,000 years earlier. Well, however shaky Burlington's rationale, there's no question that the Palladian picture frame, or Kentian frame, is indeed a distinctively British style. The single example of a Kentian frame at Lincoln's Inn is typical, with its projecting square corners, raised inner moulding, raised outer egg and dart moulding, and the flat sanded section or frieze between, where sand was sprinkled onto wet size prior to gilding. While Sir Henry Hobart, seen here, lived over a century before this frame was made, its reddish tone helps the gold chain of office to sing out, and I rather like to think Inigo Jones, his contemporary, would have been delighted to see a Palladian frame. Jones was rather forced to go along with a craze for all things auricular. Now, as we all know, you can't keep out French influence for long, and the Rococo style, so strongly associated with Louis XV, crept into England in the 1730s, and by the 1750s and 60s it was the very height of fashion, despite the fact that it was a time of war and intense rivalry with France. Like Rococo architecture, the sweeping curves, extravagant asymmetry, flyaway scrolls, and delicate floweriness of these Rococo frames lends them a marked lightness and elegance. English designers and carvers produced their own versions of Rococo frames, generally more symmetrical, more shallowly carved, somewhat broderie anglaise in appearance, as we see in this fine example on Lord Mansfield. Italian influence also reasserted itself in the middle of the 18th century with the Murata frame, named for the last great Roman Baroque painter Carlo Murata. It's distinctive for its band of carved acanthus leaves and tongues placed in the depth of the front hollow. It's a frame widely used for portraits by Joshua Reynolds, as we see here with Lord Loughborough, though in fact I believe this to be a 19th century plaster composition version of the pattern. While the Kentian frame survived alongside Rococo frames, by the 1760s, the lighter, more graceful classicism of Robert Adam and associated architects slowly saw Palladianism go out of fashion. There's no single definitive neoclassical frame type, the style developing over a period of 60-odd years, the common elements really being little more than a rectilinear outline and the use of some form of neoclassical ornament. The neoclassical frame on the portrait of the Ciceronian Lord Erskine has a ribbed top edge, similar to a frame favoured by the artist Rumney, and the leaf and dart fillet that you can see towards the sight edge is, again, very typical of these frames. The fluted hollow neoclassical frame, here with acanthus mitre leaves and twisted ribbon fillets on the inn's portrait of Pitt the Younger, is another popular and long-lived pattern found on many portraits in Sir Robert Peel's collection of statesmen, many of which found their way into public collections where you may indeed have seen them. Frames like these were readily and inexpensively reproducible from the use of compo, a composition of chalk plaster and glue, essentially, with moulded decorations applied onto a deal frame, sometimes with base metal pseudo-gilding. As a result of the use of compo, in the first 4 decades of the 19th century, frames became somewhat homogenized, repetitious, and standardized. With a slump in demand for handcraft frames, the social status of the frame maker collapsed. Carvers began to disappear, a loss of craft skills further hastened by the Industrial Revolution. In contrast to the delicate architectural language of Robert Adam, the fashion in the Regency for heavier, more masculine architecture was reflected in picture frames, becoming markedly more wide and deep and more richly decorated, typically with all-over small compo ornamentation. In the 1820s and 30s, some revival styles became fashionable, and to satisfy it, older frames were copied using compo, generally of very poor quality in comparison with the originals. The 1840s portrait of Prince Albert in the inn is in a contemporary gilt composition frame with a running arabesque of small foliage in compo on a heavy section convex cushion, with slightly projecting scroll corners drawn from Baroque and Rococo forms. It's derived from a frame style developed by Sir Thomas Lawrence in the 1820s, and it continued to be used as a standard pattern for portraits of royalty and statesmen, and yes, again in Sir Robert Peel's collection. While compo made mass production of large, richly ornamented frames relatively inexpensive, it was a brittle material, prone to breaking off as it aged and revealing its stark whiteness beneath the gilding or bronzing, as I'm sure we have all seen. I've mentioned that the frames were badly designed and constructed. In the mid-19th century, there was a reaction to this shoddiness, and while the literature on picture frames credits the revival of honest materials and ornamentation to the pre-Raphaelites, their undoubted advances were a direct response to the architect Augustus Pugin's emphasis on truth to materials and honesty of construction, ideas which transformed architectural taste in Britain, indeed transformed architecture in Britain, and strongly influenced the important arts and crafts movement which was to follow. The portrait of Lord Selborne we see here by G.F. Watts has, appropriately enough, a Watts frame, named for the artist who might have designed it. You see that compo ornaments restricted to the raised inner and outer mouldings, the novelty being that the flat area between was gilded directly onto oak, resulting in a very pleasing natural wood grain. Around the start of the 20th century, there was some revived interest in the carved frames of the 17th and 18th centuries, an example of which is this Pitti Palace revival frame on the portrait of Lord Alveston. It's a pattern balanced on the cusp of mannerism. It's widely used by the artist Sir Arthur Stockdale Cope, who indeed painted Lord Alveston. While many frames were copied from original examples and using compo, it was generally to a far higher standard and attention to detail than we saw in the 19th century revival styles. Incidentally, while this frame is inventoried as composition, and while it hangs too high for me to get my hands on, I firmly suspect it to be carved, and with its bold scrolling and great cluster corners, it's a fine example of its kind. While leading portrait artists and top dealers like Duveen were busy sourcing period frames, or more frequently having them copied, other artists and curators were beginning to reconsider the design and even the necessity of picture frames. The Impressionists rejected ornate gilt frames and experimented with simple coloured frames, although ironically, most of their works ended up in magnificently carved Louis XIV frames, sometimes stripped and colour washed as a reflection of their great value and to harmonise with the interiors of their rich, often American collectors. Cubists like Picasso and Braque subverted the frame, sometimes using rope, for example. John Bratby pasted instructions not to frame his pictures onto the reverse of his canvases. He regarded frames as a Philistine encroachment. Only thin batten strips nailed to the side of the stretcher were permitted, and strangely, this caught on with artists anyway, in the second half of the 20th century. It's a complex period. However, it's surely no coincidence that the long and intimate relationship of architecture and picture frames came to an end at the same time that architecture rejected ornament and embraced minimalism, when it became obsessed with ideology rather than concerned with people, and when the rigid formalization of architectural training severed all links with native craft traditions. In post-war Britain, there were three marked trends: the use of generally unornamented gold or silver leaf frames, the introduction of simple, narrow metal section frames, and the use of polished, unpolished, or ebonized wood, all generally in flatter, simpler sections than used in the past. Brian Organ's portrait of Princess Margaret at Lincoln's Inn has a minimalist aluminium frame typical of the 1960s and 70s. It's a successful frame in that the silvery white tones and linear forms of the portrait are emphasized by the narrow metallic material and the frame's floating construction. As a stylistic unity, it's calm and dignified, though perhaps a trifle dull, unlike her late Royal Majesty. The metal frames came in, went out of fashion. Traditional woods such as oak, ash, cherry, and pine remain fixtures. The ebonized moulded frames on the portraits of Lady Arden and Lord Newburgh by Keith Breeden seem to hark back to the sober Tudor box frames we saw at the very beginning of British secular picture framing, though in fact are most like the holy black Dutch frames of the 17th century. So, despite having rather romped through the history and the stylistic development of picture frames, you will no doubt have gathered that frames fulfill a complex array of practical functions and sensory purposes, which I shall now try to briefly summarize. Well, functionally, frames provide long-term protection to an artwork, enabling us to handle a painting safely and to facilitate its secure physical attachment to a wall for display and enjoyment. The sensory purpose of picture frames is to draw the eye into the picture, to focus attention on the subject, to emphasize its color, to enhance the discipline of its composition, and to evoke our emotional and rational responses. We've seen that a frame can carry symbolic meanings related to the underlying social, political, or religious climate of the time. And this adds a further layer of interpretation to an artwork, assuming we know how to read it. We've seen that a frame has the ability to make the edge of a painting less finite, creating an illusion that the pictorial plane continues beyond the frame, an illusion reinforced by a frame's three-dimensionality and similarity to a window or doorway. And it's clear that thinking of a frame as a marriage with a painting, while correct, tells only half the story. What architects like Jones and Kent understood, and artists like Mondrian and Bratby didn't, is that a frame is a bridge by which a painting not only enters a room, but through which it also relates to the room aesthetically. When well designed, a picture frame is capable of both flattering a picture and harmonizing with the decor of the room in which it hangs. So a picture frame is more than just a practical or decorative element. The frame is a crucial part of our experience of art, influencing how we see, interpret, and appreciate a painting, making it more memorable, perhaps, and achieving an aesthetic coherence with its setting. What's truly remarkable is that the right frame does this quietly and unobtrusively, so that we hardly notice that it's there. As well as fulfilling a complex mix of functions and purposes, frames can sometimes have a hidden significance, which, carefully interpreted, can help us to understand more about the period and circumstances in which both the frame and the picture for which it was designed were made. Let's examine 3 case studies to see how this hidden significance can be coaxed out of picture frames. For the first case study, we return to the carved Sunderland frames on the 5 fire judge portraits by John Michael Wright, which hang in the New Hall at Lincoln's Inn. Incidentally, these are the 4 that I didn't show earlier. The frames are exceptional not just because of their scale and quality, but because they're incredibly well documented, and this holds some interesting secrets. For example, from archival sources, we know that the fire judge frames were originally gilded and successively re-gilded until the early 19th century, when they were painted black, possibly to conform with Gothic Revival architectural taste. As English auricular frames, they had an irregularly shaped sight edge. It's interesting to see that after being ebonized, the portraits at Lincoln's Inn had gilt slips added to them, as you see on the left, presumably because it was discovered too late that ebonized frames set on dark backgrounds have a tendency to disappear. On the right, you see the frame on the portrait of Sir William Ellis, which is in the Royal Courts of Justice, and that enables us to envisage how these frames looked originally. From the Corporation of London's records, we discover that Jeremiah Wright, the artist's brother, was paid £6 10 for painting the coats of arms of the judges within the cartouche at the top of the frames, and their names within the plaque at the bottom, at least for those frames that have them. Not all do. We learn that John Norris was paid £14 to make the first frame. He'd made the auricular frame on the Duke of Lauderdale, we saw at Ham earlier, and incidentally, he made frames for Samuel Pepys, whose diaries record a visit to Norris's premises in Longacre in Covent Garden. While Norris carved what can be termed the prototype, what is far less widely known is that the commission for the rest of the frames went quite remarkably, in an age when frame-making was utterly dominated by men, to 3 women, all named Mary: Mary Ashfield, Mary Flechier, and Mary Dorrell, the mothers of invention, as Zappa might have called them. These ladies charged £12 per frame, as opposed to £14, saving the corporation the tidy sum of £42. The multiple carvers and production over a number of years probably explains the stylistic variations or differences between them. Here, then, is one episode in the untold history of women in British picture frame making. And the thought that 250 years before women were admitted to the bar, the creativity and commercial acumen of these 3 women has been standing in plain sight is, I think you'll agree, rather satisfying. If that is not hidden significance, then what is? For the second case study, we turn to Hogarth's Paul before Felix, which hangs in the Old Hall at Lincoln's Inn. In 1745, Thomas Lord Wyndham left £200 to Lincoln Inn for a painting, I quote, to adorn the chapel, hall, or both. In 1748, the inn commissioned Hogarth to paint this history painting, a rare example and one of his largest and least known works. The picture frame it carries today is not the original, but thanks to the inn's exemplary record keeping and the diligence of its librarians and archivists, we know that it is in fact the third frame and can tell the interesting story of how it came to be there. In a letter dated 28th of June 1748, Hogarth describes and sketches his design for the original frame, featuring richly scrolled, carved ornament in the centres and corners, with something of a Rococo flourish. He mentions consulting a frame maker, a Mr. Gossett of Barwick Street, and the frame would cost £30 gilt, £5 less if Lord Wyndham's arms were omitted. We can't be certain which member of the Gossett family of Berwick Street made the frame. However, an entry in the Black Books for 23rd of April 1751 records that Isaac Gossett was paid £25, so he seems the most likely one. Incidentally, to the left is the receipt or account rendered for the picture with Hogarth's autograph, which is a magnificent document to have. While the inn's payment was £5 less than the higher sum, it seems clear from T.H. Shepherd's drawing of about 1830, reproduced here in this engraving in the 1840s, that Lord Wyndham's arms were carved at the crest, though without the supporters. The frame otherwise appears to be largely consistent with Hogarth's sketch. From the Gentleman's Magazine, we learned that earlier, in 1819, the frame had been cleaned and freshly gilt, giving it, I quote, a fine appearance. However, in 1845, the Black Books record that the original frame was replaced with an oak frame. No reason is given. However, I strongly suspect that the completion of the Gothic Revival New Hall in exactly the same year made a decorative gilt frame of a century before appear out of step with the inn's preferred architectural style. Then in 1877, Hogarth's letter and sketch were rediscovered, and the inn ordered a frame to be made according to the original design. The work was undertaken by Alfred Mucklow of Princess Street, London, at a cost of £50, or double what Isaac Gossett had received 126 years earlier. The frame is undoubtedly handsome, and its linear classical style are highly appropriate to a history painting. However, with its outset corners and outer egg and dart moulding, it appears to be more the work of a Victorian framemaker channeling William Kent, rather than any serious attempt to replicate Hogarth's design or Gossett's design that you see on the right. While a frame closer to Hogarth's design would have been preferable, there seems no point in disturbing the picture frame now. For the third case study, we remain with Thomas Lord Wyndham, whose bequest had funded the Hogarth, portrayed here as Chief Justice of the Common Pleas of Ireland, which is in a collection that I curate. The portrait isn't signed, but confidently attributed to Charles Jarvis. He rarely signed his work. And what first excited my attention, however, was the particularly crisply carved Baroque giltwood frame. It's unusually fine quality, and I hadn't come across an English frame like it before. Thomas Wyndham was Chief Justice from 1724 to 1726, when he was appointed Lord Chancellor of Ireland, a post he held until 1739. So the style of the frame fits within the date range, and this creates the intriguing possibility that the picture and frame might be on their first marriage. So how do we go about finding out whether a frame is original to its painting? Well, briefly, there's first a physical examination. In this case, there was no sign of the frame having been tampered with or altered, say, to fit the canvas. Second, we use research, and in this case, a will of 1745 and an inventory of 1749 established that after the painting left Dublin in 1739, the picture remained in family ownership and in the same house, in fact, till the late 20th century, as evidenced by a later inventory and catalogue of pictures. In fact, in the Country Life photograph in 1925, you see here, the portrait was still to be found in the same room and position as it had been in 1849. Nothing in the documentary record pointed to its being reframed, a mention of its being regilded only adding to the story of continuity. As an architectural historian, my attention was also drawn to the buildings in the background of the portrait. I hope you can see them in this light. Is it simply an architectural capriccio designed to dignify the sitter? While Jarvis worked predominantly in England, we know that he visited Ireland in 1729, and this date chimed with Thomas Wyndham having laid the foundation stone of Ireland's new Parliament building in the same year. Incidentally, the world's first purpose-built bicameral Parliament building. Designed in the Palladian style by Edward Lovett Pearce, the appearance of the building was well understood in 1729, as this pen and wash drawing of that date attests, attributed to the architect, by the way. Which begs the question, did Jarvis know Pearce? Had Jarvis seen Pearce's drawings and included a representation of them to commemorate Wyndham's involvement? There are certainly points of similarity, as you can see in the architectural forms. Moreover, as Pearce, like Kent, designed integrated architectural elements for interiors, had Pearce designed the frame? Who in Ireland might have carved such an exceptionally fine frame? Perhaps John Houghton, whom Pearce engaged to undertake all of the carving in the new Parliament House. Well, this remained little more than informed speculation until late last year, when a signed and dated portrait of Thomas Carter came up for sale in Dublin in a strikingly similar frame. It was painted on another of Jarvis's recorded trips to Ireland in 1734. Jarvis had pursued an enormously successful and lucrative career at the Irish Bar before purchasing the Mastership of the Rolls for £11,000. Those were the days. Placed side by side with Thomas Wyndham's portrait, you can see that the two frames are not quite identical, the Wyndham frame being somewhat lighter in section, with a slightly different arrangement, though, of similar motifs. However, the correspondent style and quality of carving are more than sufficient to say that both frames came from the same workshop. Research established that, exactly like Wyndham's portrait, Carter's remained in direct family descent from 1734, when it was painted, all the way up until 2024, when it was sold. His wife's portrait had been reframed, but there was no evidence in the archives of this picture being reframed. As the picture had never left Ireland, it made it seem more certain that the frame was Irish. But the significance of the discovery goes slightly further. It turns out that Carter was a close friend of Jarvis's, later acting as executor of his will, and the architect of the new Parliament House, Edward Lovett Pearce, was a first cousin of Carter's wife, Anne. Pearce had designed their palatial Dublin house in Henrietta Street, which contained carved architectural ornament attributed to John Houghton. There's much more to say, and research continues. However, I hope that this and the other case studies go some way to demonstrating how much important information can be gleaned from and through a picture frame. In this case, the frame has helped to identify the occasion for which the portrait was painted, where it was painted, where its frame was made, who might have designed it, who might have carved it, and its provenance and artist attribution greatly strengthened. By establishing a link between the Wyndham and Carter portrait frames, a more important set of significances emerges, one in which we see political, religious alignments of interest in a dependent territory of Britain, a friendship between an artist and an architect, and more importantly, friendships of artists and architects with leading lawyers and statesmen. It's a good example of the influential role of architects as tastemakers for an age. I mean, just as Burlington led England into Whiggish English Protestant Palladian style, so Pearce did in Ireland. Returning now to the sensory influence of picture frames, I think we're all aware that a picture frame can make or break a painting. So how do we make the right choices? Well, it's a huge subject, requiring at least one lecture on its own. However, what I can say at this stage is that if a frame is not to attract the eye first, and if it is to achieve a harmonious unity with a painting, it needs to work very closely with the picture's colours, composition, scale, subject, and to some extent, period, to some extent. And then there are other sort of fundamental interrelated factors to consider: the shape, design, ornamentation, and finish of the frame. The proportion of any ornament obviously working with the scale of the painting's composition. I think the easiest way to talk about it is to pick a few frame horrors, if I'll be forgiven, from the Lincoln's Inn collection, and we'll try and reframe them. So sometimes a change of frame is accidental, and at Lincoln's Inn it's suspected that the frames on the portraits of Sir Matthew Hale and Lord Mansfield were mistakenly swapped when they were removed from storage after the Second World War. It was Ben Pearson, the Inn's frame restorer, who first suspected that they were the wrong way round and wisely recommended swapping them. With little digital magic, we can see how the portraits looked before the frames were swapped. While Lord Mansfield's rather dandyish portrait becomes a comparatively prosaic country house picture, despite his fine gold braid, we can immediately see how the projecting corners and centres of the Rococo frame draw in the eye and attention to Hale's head and hands. However, the stolid bulk and quiet authority of the great man is made somewhat ridiculous by these frivolous rhythms of Rococo, even if the paler gold succeeds in picking up his ermine. Both appear happier in frames more contemporary with their portraits. The frame on the portrait of Sir James Leigh is a true horror, a Frankenstein hybrid of lily panel Baroque and Rococo elements, made tragically worse with a deep hardwood slip which utterly dwarfs the sitter, the whole lending a clownish effect to what was intended to be a dignified portrait. Placed in a Tudor frame on the right, it's less the period correctness of the frame and more its colour and proportional relationship to the portrait that bring the sitter into focus and confer a sober dignity as befits a Lord High Treasurer. The linear gilding on the sight edge picks up his wand of office, as I think you can see. Yes, so a moment ago we saw that the panel frame made Sir Matthew Hale look a bit dull, and the sweeping curves and rhythms of the Rococo frame didn't exactly do justice to an exceptional judge and jurist. In the collection which I curate, there's a portrait of his contemporary judge, Sir Wadham Wyndham, which is in a probably contemporary leaf and fruit Baroque frame, attributed to John Norris, incidentally, of whom we've heard much. So shall we see how this works on Sir Matthew Hale? The wider frame section and richer carving of the Baroque frame, I think, brings a well-deserved authority and presence to the sitter. The rhythm of carved decoration emphasizes aspects like the wavy line of ermine on his cowl, and the red toning of fresh gilding, I think, makes the robes sing out. Hale seems to stand taller and prouder. It's a successful marriage of portrait and frame, as I hope you agree. Last, let's look at the Inn's portrait of Charles II. While not strictly a horror, the narrow section on the composition frame feels, as you can see, extremely pinched. It's more appropriate for a poster than a lily portrait. The scale of the frame completely fails to announce the importance of the sitter, and its profile and tone do nothing to emphasize the painting's colours or composition. Now, to my eye, the swirling folds in the golden wall hangings behind the king, the rich drapery and the curled wig are perfectly emphasized by a sensitively toned carved auricular frame, which happens to be correct for period. While an original frame of this size would be quite challenging to source, this in fact is a modern carved frame, so it is perfectly achievable. While it's one instance where I would not hesitate to recommend a reframe, I'm aware that the inn has rather more pressing needs for its funds. You would have gathered, I think, that the history, purpose, and stylistic development of picture frames is a vast field of study, even by greatly narrowing the scope to English portrait frames and the Lincoln's Inn collection in particular. Time constraints have compelled me to fairly canter through the main styles and centuries, and to omit other styles and aspects such as frame conservation and frame construction. However, for those of you with sufficient stamina to explore picture frames further, there are fortunately some good books written by art historians rather than architectural historians, of which I would recommend these three. Paul Mitchell and Lynn Roberts' History of European Picture Frames is a pioneering academic work aimed at the serious student. Jacob Simon's Art of the Picture Frame, a more approachably and engagingly written book and an indispensable reference to the English portrait frame. Nicholas Penny's Closer Look at Frames, a useful brief introduction to some of the main European styles. Its hand list of examples in the National Gallery enables a very good self-guided tour. And by no means least, the frameblog.com, a specialist online magazine devoted to the study of antique picture frames. It's free, run by Lynn Roberts. It's a staggeringly comprehensive and scholarly resource that I cannot commend to you strongly enough. So, to conclude, we've seen that while art preceded the picture frame, there were no picture frames without architecture. The emergence of Gothic architecture in the late 12th century is the moment in Europe when picture frames and architecture begin an intimate relationship, and it's the date from which the design of picture frames predominantly followed architectural style all the way up to until the 20th century. That the relationship of picture frames is closer to architecture than art is explained by their three-dimensionality. Unlike paintings, picture frames are inherently sculptural and therefore related to architectural ornament. While the literature on picture frames likes to distinguish between artists and architects as frame designers, we've seen that prior to the 20th century, most of the important artist frame designers were also architects. Architect-artist designers such as Sansovino, Michelangelo, Bontalenti, Jones, Kent, Adam, Pugin, to name but a few, either designed or directly inspired the design of most of the main styles of picture frames. It seems clear that the historic picture frame is in fact a branch of architectural design. The uniquely British obsession with portraiture means that the history of the British picture frame is essentially the history of the British portrait frame, and that makes the paintings at Lincoln's Inn a truly representative as well as historically important collection. Whether looking around the inn's collection, which I believe you'll shortly have an opportunity to do with a welcome glass of wine, in public galleries or at home, I hope you feel encouraged to look more closely at picture frames and in so doing derive a greater enjoyment and understanding from paintings through their important relationship with picture frames. Finally, should you feel inspired to consider reframing a painting, I must advise caution, without wishing to deprive the family lawyers here of an honest crust. While we should happily promote a trial separation of picture and frame for the purposes of study and reflection, we should only recommend a divorce on clear grounds of incompatibility. Thank you.